I want to tell you something I've never said out loud to anyone. Not to my brother, not to the one friend I have who actually listens, not even to the therapist I saw for 6 weeks before I stopped going because I realized I wasn't ready to be honest in that room. The night my wife told me she was leaving me, I wasn't surprised. That's the part that should probably concern you. I had known something was coming for months. Felt it the way you feel a storm before the sky even changes color. But what I didn't expect, what I still can't fully process even now, is what happened in the 30 seconds after she said those words. She looked past me. Her face. This woman I have shared a bed with for 14 years, this woman whose expressions I can read like a clock, went completely blank. Not sad. Not guilty. Blank. Like someone had just pulled the plug on whatever was keeping her present in that moment. I turned around slowly. And when I saw who was standing at the entrance of that restaurant, I understood everything. Every lie, every distance, every silence. And I still didn't say a word. We had a table by the window. We always did at Hargrove's. That's the kind of restaurant where they remember your name and your usual spot, which sounds romantic until you realize the reason they know you so well is because date night has become less about choosing to be together and more about maintaining the appearance of it. 14 years of marriage has a way of turning rituals into obligations without you ever noticing the exact moment the shift happened. I remember I ordered the salmon. Merritt ordered the risotto and a glass of Pinot Grigio, which she barely touched. She was dressed well. She always dressed well for these dinners, which I used to take as a sign that she still cared, still wanted to look good for me. That night, I noticed the care she'd taken with her appearance and felt something closer to suspicion than gratitude. A woman who is about to blow up her marriage doesn't dress carelessly. She dresses like armor. We talked about nothing for the first 20 minutes. That's not me being cruel, that's just the truth. We talked about the Hendersons next door and their new fence that was somehow 2 inches over our property line. We talked about whether the hot water heater was making a new sound or the same old sound. She mentioned something about a budget meeting at the hospital that had run 3 hours long. I nodded. I asked a follow-up question because that's what you do. She answered it without really looking at me. This was us. This had been us for a while. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I am not telling you this story to make Merritt the villain. I've spent a lot of time in my own head over the past several months trying to resist that temptation, because it's the easiest thing in the world to do when a marriage falls apart. To cast yourself as the one who tried and the other person as the one who destroyed it. The truth is almost never that clean. I know that. I knew it even sitting across from her that night, watching her move risotto around her plate like she was solving a puzzle she'd already lost interest in. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It was around the time they cleared our appetizer plates that I noticed she had stopped contributing to the conversation. Not in the usual way where things just go quiet and you both pull out your phones and pretend that's normal. This was different. She put her fork down very deliberately. She folded her hands on the table. She looked at me. Really looked at me. Maybe for the first time in months. And I felt my stomach drop before she even opened her mouth. I think I actually braced myself. Like physically. Like I gripped the edge of my seat. She said, "Aldrich, I need to say something to you, and I need you to just listen first before you respond." I said, "Okay." She said, "I think we've been pretending for a long time, both of us. And I think we both know it. Even if we haven't said it. And I don't want to keep doing that. I don't think it's good for either of us." I remember looking at her hands folded on the table and thinking she had practiced this. The phrasing was too measured. The pauses were in the right places. This wasn't something that had bubbled up over dinner. This was something she had rehearsed, probably multiple times. Maybe in the car on the way here. Maybe in front of the bathroom mirror that morning. I said, "What are you saying, Merritt?" It wasn't even a question the way I said it. And it came out flat. She held my eyes and she said, "I'm saying I think we should end this. I think we should separate. I think we've been holding each other in place for years and neither of us is actually happy. And I don't want to wait until we hate each other to admit that. And here is the thing I need you to sit with for a second. Here is the part that I keep turning over in my mind even now. I wasn't surprised. I felt something. Don't get me wrong. There was a physical sensation, something in my chest that I can only describe as a slow deflation, like air leaving a room rather than a person. There was something that might have been grief or might have been relief, and the fact that I couldn't immediately tell the difference between those two things told me everything I needed to know about where we had ended up. But surprised? No, I was not surprised. What I was angry. And not for the reason you'd expect. I wasn't angry because she wanted to leave. I was angry because of how calm she was, because of how prepared she was, because she had clearly been living with this decision for some time, had turned it over, made peace with it, constructed the language for it. While I had been sitting across from her at dinners just like this one, reading the distance between us as something we might still find our way back from. She had already left. She was just now telling me. I opened my mouth to say something. I genuinely don't know what it would have been. Something honest, probably. Something I couldn't take back. And that is when I heard the door. Hargrove's has this particular door. Heavy wood and brass, and it makes a sound when it opens. A kind of weighted exhale, like the building itself is sighing. I'd heard that sound 100 times and never paid attention to it. That night I registered it the way you register a sound in a dream that pulls you back toward waking. I saw Merritt's eyes move first, just slightly. A flicker up and past my left shoulder toward the entrance. And then something happened to her face that I had never seen happen to her face before in 14 years of knowing her. Every muscle in it went still. Not tense, not guilty. Just still, like a photograph of a person rather than the person themselves. I turned around, and I saw Solène standing at the entrance of the restaurant. And she was scanning the room the way you do when you're looking for someone. She was dressed simply, dark coat, hair down, no particular effort made. She looked like someone who had stopped in on an impulse, or at least wanted to appear that way. Her eyes moved across the room with that casual sweep, and then they landed on our table and they stopped. She looked at me first, just for a second. Then she looked at Merritt. And Merritt, my wife, and the woman who had just delivered what sounded like a prepared closing argument on our marriage, said absolutely nothing. Did absolutely nothing. Just sat there with her hands still folded on the table and her face still completely, utterly still. I turned back around. I picked up my water glass. I took a sip. I set it back down. And I said to Merritt very quietly, "Do you want to tell her to join us, or should I?" Merritt's eyes came back to me slowly, and as something moved through them that I couldn't name then and still can't name now. It wasn't quite fear. It wasn't quite relief. It was something more complicated than either of those things. The look of someone who has been running a very careful calculation and has just realized one of the numbers was wrong. She didn't answer me. She just picked up her wine glass and took the first real sip she'd taken all evening. And the three of us stayed suspended in that moment. Me, my wife, and the woman I had known about for 3 months and never once confronted either of them about, while the sounds of the restaurant carried on around us like nothing in the world had just shifted. Let me take you back 3 months. It was a Tuesday, which matters only because Tuesdays were the one night Merritt and I had an unspoken agreement about. No late work, no hospital calls unless it was genuinely critical. We'd cook something at home, open a bottle of something decent, and exist in the same space without the performance of trying. It wasn't romantic. It hadn't been romantic in a long time, but it was comfortable in the way that a worn-out couch is comfortable. Not something you'd choose new, but something you'd notice immediately if it was gone. Except that Tuesday, Merritt called at 6:15 to say she had a board presentation the following morning that had been moved up and she needed to stay late to prepare. I said fine. I said I'd save her a plate. I hung up and stood in the kitchen for a moment with my hand still on the counter and something quiet and unnameable sitting in the back of my chest. I didn't think anything specific. I want to be honest about that. I wasn't suspicious in any conscious, formed way. It was more like a frequency I'd been picking up for months that I'd never allowed myself to tune into fully, because tuning into it would mean having to do something about what I heard. I made dinner for one. I watched something on television I couldn't tell you anything about now. I went to bed before she got home. What I didn't do, and this is important, was check her phone. I want you to know that, because what I'm about to tell you didn't come from snooping. I've never been that person. I don't believe in it, not because I'm above jealousy or insecurity, but because I've always believed that if you've gotten to the point where you're going through someone's phone, the information you find almost doesn't matter anymore. The relationship is already somewhere you can't come back from. What happened was simpler and more accidental, and somehow worse. She left her laptop open on the kitchen table. That's it. That's the whole entry point. She came home late, she was tired, she made herself a cup of tea and brought it to bed, and she left her laptop open on the kitchen table with her email pulled up on the screen. When I came downstairs at around 2 in the morning because I couldn't sleep. I'd been doing that a lot, waking up in the middle of the night for no clear reason, like my body was trying to tell me something my brain was refusing to process. And I walked through the kitchen to get a glass of water and I saw the screen. I wasn't going to look. I genuinely wasn't. But the name in the subject line caught me before I could look away. Solène Vautier. I knew that name. I knew it the way you know the name of a character in a story your spouse told you years ago. Present in memory, but filed away under things that don't require active attention. Merritt had mentioned her maybe 4 or 5 times across the course of our marriage. College roommate. They'd been close, then drifted, the way people drift. Merritt had described her once as the most interesting person I've ever known, and then immediately changed the subject in a way that, at the time, I took for nostalgia. We all have people from our past that we describe with that particular reverence and then don't pursue because life moves forward and nostalgia is easier to carry than actual connection. Except the email on that screen was not old. The timestamp was from 3 days prior, and the subject line wasn't something vague or friendly. It said, "We need to talk about what happens when he finds out." I stood in my kitchen at 2 in the morning and I read that subject line 4 times. Then I stepped back from the laptop. I got my glass of water. I went back upstairs. I lay in the dark next to my sleeping wife and I stared at the ceiling and I made a decision that I still don't entirely know how to explain to you. I decided not to say anything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. I hadn't read the email itself, just the subject line. And I told myself that was deliberate, that there was a version of this where I was misreading something, where Solène was someone who had come back into Merritt's life in an innocent way, and the subject line meant something other than what it sounded like. I'm aware of how that sounds. I'm aware that it sounds like a man constructing a reason not to know what he already knows. You're probably right. But there was something else underneath it. Something I'm not proud of, but I'm going to tell you anyway because I promised myself this would be honest. When I read those words, what happens when he finds out? There was a part of me that felt something clarify, like a lens coming into focus. Because suddenly all the distance and all the silence and all the carefully managed separateness of the past year or more had a shape. It wasn't just entropy. It wasn't just 2 people growing apart the way people do when life gets heavy and love gets quiet. There was a specific thing. There was a name. And knowing that, even incompletely, even without the full picture, gave me something I hadn't had in a long time. It gave me leverage, even if I never used it. I know how that sounds. I'm not asking you to think well of me. I'm asking you to understand that when you've been living inside a slow, quiet unraveling for long enough, and you've been telling yourself it's normal, it's just marriage, it's just the way things go, and then suddenly you catch the edge of the actual truth. There's a moment, however ugly, where you think, I'm not crazy, I'm not imagining this, something real is happening and I actually know something about it. That moment felt like power. even though everything underneath it was loss. Over the following weeks, I watched differently. That's the only way I can describe it. I wasn't surveilling her. I wasn't checking her whereabouts or going through her things. I was just paying attention in a way I had stopped paying attention. The way you start hearing a sound in your car engine once someone points it out to you. The Friday night, she said she was at a hospital fundraiser and came home with no event lanyard, no program, no particular smell of a banquet hall or event venue. Just a quiet, contained energy, like someone who has just come down from something. The Saturday morning phone call she took in the backyard, pacing the length of the garden in a way she only paces when something has emotional stakes. The way she started being slightly warmer to me in the weeks after, more present at dinner, more likely to ask about my day with what felt like actual interest. And how that warmth felt, paradoxically, more alarming than the distance had. Like she was compensating. Like guilt was making her generous. I said nothing. I just watched. And then I did one thing. One deliberate thing. About 6 weeks before that dinner at Hargrove's, I looked up Solène Vautier online. And not in any complicated way, just a name search, the kind anyone would do. She wasn't hard to find. She had a LinkedIn profile and an Instagram that was mostly private, but had a public profile photo and a handful of visible posts. She lived in the city. She had moved back, it appeared, sometime in the past year. She worked in architectural consulting. She was, objectively, striking in the way of someone who doesn't appear to be trying particularly hard to be striking, which is always the most unsettling kind. There was one photo that was public. A candid, someone else had tagged her in it, taken at what looked like a gallery opening or some kind of event. She was laughing at something off camera, a glass in her hand, completely unaware of being photographed. And I sat there looking at that photograph for longer than I should have, and I tried to locate what I was feeling, and the closest I could get to naming it was this. I was trying to understand what it was about this person that had the power to make my wife into someone I didn't recognize. I didn't find an answer in a photograph. Of course I didn't. That's not how any of this works. But I kept coming back to the image over the following days in the way you keep pressing a bruise. Not because it feels good, not even because you want to understand it, but because the pressure is the only proof that something real is there. By the time Merritt sat across from me at Hargrove's and folded her hands on the table and said what she had clearly prepared herself to say, I had been carrying all of this for 3 months. 3 months of knowing something I wasn't supposed to know. By 3 months of watching my wife love someone else, or whatever the precise word is for what was happening, while cooking dinner and paying the mortgage and asking about her board meetings and sleeping 4 inches away from her in the dark. And when Solène walked through that door and Merritt's face went still as a stopped clock, I felt something I still can't fully categorize. It wasn't rage. It wasn't even hurt, not exactly. It was something more like the feeling you get at the end of a very long book when you finally reach the page that explains everything that came before it. A grim, exhausted, terrible recognition. I had asked Merritt whether Solène should join us. Merritt had not answered. Solène was still standing near the entrance. She hadn't moved toward us or away from us. She was just standing there, holding what appeared to be a decision she hadn't finished making. So then the 3 of us were locked into something that had no clean name and no obvious next move. I turned back toward the window. Outside, the street was carrying on the way streets do. People walking, a car idling, someone laughing at something on their phone. The ordinary world doing its ordinary thing, completely indifferent to the fact that 14 years of my life were currently balanced on the edge of a restaurant table like something about to fall. Merritt set her wine glass down. She looked at me. Really looked at me. And she said, Aldrich, how long have you known? I looked back at her. I didn't answer right away. I thought about the laptop screen at 2 in the morning. I thought about the backyard phone calls and the missing event lanyard and the photograph of a woman laughing at something off camera. I thought about 3 months of silence that I had chosen deliberately and weaponized quietly and lived inside of like a man who has found a door but isn't ready to open it. I thought about what it means to love someone for 14 years and still not be sure, in this moment, whether what you're feeling is grief or something colder than grief. And then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps crossing the restaurant floor toward our table. She didn't sit down right away. That's the first thing I noticed. Most people, when they approach a table in a restaurant, have already decided whether they're staying. The body language gives it away before the words do. You either pull out a chair or you hover, and hovering means you're leaving yourself an exit. Solène hovered. She stood at the edge of our table with one hand resting lightly on the back of the empty chair beside Merritt, and she looked at the two of us with an expression that I can only describe as carefully neutral. Like someone who had walked into a situation they had partially anticipated and was now recalibrating in real time. I looked at her directly. I wanted her to know that I was looking at her directly. I didn't smile and I didn't scowl, and I didn't do any of the things a man is supposed to do when he is ambushed by something he has actually been expecting for 3 months. I just looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to understand from a distance and are now finally seeing up close. She was taller than I expected. I don't know why I expected anything different. A LinkedIn profile photo doesn't tell you much about a person's physical presence, but there was something about the way she occupied space that felt deliberate. Contained, like someone who had learned a long time ago how to take up exactly as much room as she needed and not 1 inch more. She said, "I didn't know you'd be here." She was talking to Merritt, not to me. Merritt said, "Solène." Just the name. Nothing attached to it, no explanation, no apology, no instruction. Just the name, spoken in a voice I had never heard Merritt use before. Low and careful and stripped of everything extra, like she was handling something fragile. I said, "Why don't you sit down?" Both of them looked at me. I think they were both surprised that I was the one who said it, and said it that calmly. To be fair, I was a little surprised myself. Solène looked at Merritt. Merritt looked at me. I picked up my water glass and took a sip and waited. After a moment, Solène pulled out the chair and sat down. A waiter appeared almost immediately. They're attentive at Hargrove's, sometimes annoyingly so, and asked if we'd like another menu. I said yes before either of the women could redirect him. He disappeared. The three of us sat in a triangle of silence that felt loud in the way that only silences with history behind them can feel loud. I want you to understand what that table felt like. On the surface, it looked like nothing. 3 adults at a restaurant. A couple and a friend who had stopped by. The kind of unremarkable tableau that happens in restaurants across the country every single night. Nobody around us had any reason to look twice. The couple 2 tables over were arguing quietly about something involving their kids' school. The man at the bar was watching a game on the mounted screen. The world was doing what the world does. But at our table, something was being negotiated that nobody had agreed to negotiate out loud. Solène folded her hands on the table, and I noticed, with a kind of dull shock, that she folded them in almost exactly the same way Merritt had folded hers 20 minutes earlier when she was preparing to dismantle our marriage. I don't know what to do with that detail. I just know I noticed it and filed it away the way I'd been filing things away for 3 months. She said, "I'm sorry to interrupt your evening." I said, "You're not interrupting. We were just having a conversation." Merritt made a small sound that wasn't quite a word. Solène looked at me with something that might have been assessment, like she was trying to figure out what I knew and how I knew it and what I intended to do with it. I held her gaze and let her look. I had nothing to hide at that table. I was the only one at that table with nothing to hide, which was a strange and terrible kind of power to have. I said, "Merritt was just telling me she wants to end our marriage." The words landed the way I intended them to land. I watched Solène's expression shift, just slightly, just enough. And I watched Merritt close her eyes for half a second in a way that told me she had not expected me to say it. That plainly, that quickly, in front of this particular person. Solène said, "Aldrich," I said, "it's fine. I'm not saying it to cause a scene. I'm saying it because it seems like the relevant context." There was a pause. Then Selene said, "How long have you known? About, about us?" And there it was. Merritt had asked me the same question 10 minutes ago, and I hadn't answered. Now Selene was asking it, and the shape of the evening had shifted enough that I felt something loosen in me. Not release exactly, more like the moment before release, where you can feel the thing that's been held tight beginning to give. I said, 3 months, roughly. Merritt opened her eyes. She looked at me with an expression I had never seen on her face in 14 years, and I have spent a lot of time since that night trying to find the right word for it. The closest I've gotten is this. It was the look of someone who has been telling themselves a story about another person. A story in which that person is less aware, less present, less capable of a certain kind of pain, and has just discovered the story was wrong. It wasn't guilt exactly. It was the recalibration that comes before guilt. The moment where the version of events you've been living inside shifts to accommodate a truth you weren't accounting for. She said, 3 months. I said, yes. She said, and you didn't say anything. I said, no. She looked at the table. She looked at Selene. She looked back at me. And I could see her working through it. Working through what 3 months of my silence meant. What I had seen and not said. What I had known and chosen to carry alone. I could see her understanding, maybe for the first time, that the quiet man across the dinner table who asks about board meetings and saves plates of food and goes to bed before she gets home had not been oblivious, had not been passive, had been watching, had been waiting, had known. Selene was very still. I looked at her and I said, I don't blame you. I want to say that clearly. I'm not sitting here with a list of things to say to you. I think we're past the point where pretending makes sense for any of us. She nodded slowly. There was something in her face that looked like respect, which was not what I expected, and which made me feel something complicated that I didn't examine too closely in that moment. The waiter came back with a menu for Selene. She took it without looking at it. He asked if we were ready to order. I said we needed a few more minutes. He smiled and withdrew, and I thought, briefly and absurdly, and about how many versions of this scene he must witness in a career of waiting tables. How many tables with too much silence and too much history? And whether it ever stops being remarkable. Merritt said, Aldrich, I owe you an explanation. I said, you don't have to do it here. She said, I want to. I said, Merritt. She stopped. I said, I know you practiced what you were going to say to me tonight. I could hear it in the way you said it. I'm not angry about that. I understand why you'd prepare, but whatever you practiced, I don't think it accounts for this. I gestured very slightly toward the three of us. So maybe we don't do the prepared version tonight. She looked at me for a long time. She said, when did you get like this? I said, like what? She said, like someone who... She stopped, started again. You're not reacting the way I thought you would. I said, how did you think I would react? She didn't answer that. I think the honest answer was something neither of us wanted said out loud at a table in a restaurant. That she had expected something louder, something more broken, something that would confirm a particular story she had been telling herself about our marriage and about me. And my not providing that reaction was, in its own way, more destabilizing than if I had. Selene had been quiet through all of this. Now she said quietly, I think maybe I should go. I looked at her. I said, you walked in here for a reason. She held my gaze. There was a long pause. She said, I wanted to see her. I didn't know you'd be here, that's the truth. I said, I believe you. She blinked. Like that wasn't what she expected either. I said, I believe a lot of what's happened wasn't planned. I think that probably makes it harder, not easier. For everyone. Outside the window, the street was still doing its indifferent thing. A woman walked past holding a child's hand. Or a cab pulled up to the curb. Somewhere nearby, someone dropped something, and the sound of it breaking carried briefly through the restaurant and then disappeared into the ambient noise like it had never happened. Merritt picked up her wine glass again. She held it without drinking from it. She said, in a voice that was almost too quiet to hear, "I didn't want to hurt you." I said, "I know that." She said, "I don't think that makes it better." I said, "No, it doesn't." And then nobody said anything for what felt like a very long time. The candle between us burned. The restaurant moved around us. Solène sat with her hands folded and her menu untouched, and her eyes somewhere between Merritt and the middle distance. Merritt sat with her wine glass in her hand and her prepared speech somewhere behind her now, inaccessible and irrelevant. And I sat across from both of them with 3 months of careful, our deliberate silence finally broken open on the table between us like something that had been waiting a long time to be let out. I thought about the house we'd go home to, whether we'd go home to it together or separately, whether the hot water heater was making the new sound or the same old sound, whether any of that mattered anymore or whether it had ever mattered as much as I'd let it. I thought about 14 years, what they weigh, what they cost, what you do with them when the person you spent them with turns out to have been somewhere else, emotionally, for longer than you knew, and the person they were somewhere else with is sitting 3 feet away from you in a restaurant where they remember your name and your usual table. I didn't have an answer for any of it. I still don't. I drove home alone. That's the detail that hit me hardest later. Not anything that was said at the table. Not the image of Merritt's face when I told her I'd known for 3 months. Not Solène sitting there with her untouched menu and her carefully folded hands. Just the drive home. The specific, ordinary fact of pulling out of the parking garage on Clement Street and merging into traffic and driving the 11 minutes back to a house that was going to feel different when I walked into it. And knowing it was going to feel different, and driving toward it anyway because there was nowhere else to go. And Merritt had stayed. That surprised me. When I pushed back from the table and said I needed some air, which was the most honest thing I'd said all evening, because the air in that restaurant had started to feel like something I was breathing through rather than just breathing. I expected her to follow me, or at least to call out something. Instead, she stayed in her seat, and she and Solène were still sitting there when I glanced back through the window from the sidewalk outside. Not talking, from what I could see. Just sitting. 2 people in the wreckage of something, figuring out what comes next. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The night was cold and clear, and the street smelled like exhaust and something faintly sweet from the bakery 2 doors down that always ran its ovens late. I stood there and I breathed, and I waited to feel something that had a clear name. Nothing came with a clear name. Everything came at once and unnamed, like the way real feeling usually does when you stop managing it. I got in my car and I drove home. The house was exactly as we'd left it, which sounds obvious but felt significant in the way that ordinary things feel significant when your life is in the process of changing shape. The lights we'd left on. Her coffee cup from that morning still rinsed and upside down on the drying rack. A sweater of hers draped over the back of the kitchen chair in the particular careless way she always draped things. The way that used to mildly irritate me and that I was now looking at with something that felt embarrassingly close to tenderness. I stood in the kitchen for a while. I didn't turn on the television. I didn't pour myself a drink, which is probably what you'd expect a man in my position to do, but I didn't want the blur. I wanted to stay inside what I was feeling with full clarity, even though full clarity was not comfortable. I think I needed to know that I could. I went upstairs, and I sat on the edge of the bed. My side, the left side, the side I had slept on for 14 years. And I looked at the room. Her nightstand with its particular collection of things. A half-read book she'd been half-reading for 2 months. A glass of water. A small photograph in a frame. Us, maybe 8 years ago, somewhere on a coast I can't remember. Both of us squinting into the sun and laughing about something I can't remember either. The photograph had been there so long I had stopped seeing it. I was seeing it now. I lay back on the bed without taking my shoes off and I stared at the ceiling, and I let myself think about all of it without trying to organize it into anything manageable. Here is what I kept coming back to. It wasn't the betrayal itself that was breaking something in me. Or it wasn't only that. It was the duration of it. The length of time during which I had been one version of this story. The husband in a struggling marriage, the man trying to read the distance between himself and his wife, the person telling himself that all long marriages go through seasons like this, while the actual story was something else entirely. It was the gap between those two things, the space between what I thought was happening and what was happening. That space had a size to it, now that I could see it clearly, and the size of it was staggering. 3 months I had known. But how long had it been going on before I knew? That was the question I hadn't let myself ask directly until that night, lying on my bed with my shoes on, staring at a ceiling I had stared at 1,000 times. How long had Solène been in the picture? How long had those backyard phone calls been happening? How long had the fundraiser excuse and the late board meetings and the slightly warmer, guilt-compensating version of my wife been the texture of my life without my understanding why? I didn't know. I still don't know. And the not knowing has its own particular weight. I fell asleep eventually. I don't remember deciding to. I just came back to consciousness at some point and the room was dark and the other side of the bed was still empty and the clock said 2:47 in the morning. I lay there and listened. The house was quiet. The hot water heater was making a sound. The same old sound, I decided. Just the same old sound. Merritt came home at some point before dawn. I heard the door. I heard her move through the kitchen, heard the particular creak of the third stair, heard her stop outside the bedroom door. There was a long pause, long enough that I became aware I was holding my breath. And then I heard her walk down the hall to the guest room. The door closed softly, not slammed. Softly, with a kind of consideration that felt, in its own way, like a statement. I let my breath out. I didn't sleep again after that. The next morning was a Saturday. I was in the kitchen when she came downstairs. I had made coffee. Enough for 2, automatically, without thinking about it, the way you do things you've done every Saturday morning for 14 years. She came in wearing the gray sweatshirt she always wore on weekends, and her hair pulled back and no particular expression on her face. And she poured herself a cup without saying anything and stood at the counter with it, and we existed in the same room in silence for a while. Eventually I said, "How did you sleep?" She said, "I didn't, really." I said, "Me neither." She looked at her coffee. She said, "Aldrich, I need you to know that I didn't plan for last night to happen the way it happened." I said, "Which part?" She said, "Any of it. The way I said what I said. And then Solène walking in. I didn't arrange that." I said, "I know." She looked up. "You believe me?" I said, "I believe that the timing was accidental. I don't think everything else was." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "No, not everything else." I appreciated that she didn't try to walk it back. Whatever else was happening, Merritt had always been constitutionally incapable of sustained dishonesty when directly confronted. It was one of the things I had always respected about her. It made the months of careful misdirection harder to reconcile, not easier. I said, "How long?" She knew what I was asking. She set her cup down. She looked at the window above the sink, the one that faces the backyard, the same backyard she'd paced during those phone calls. And she said, "About a year." A year. I nodded. I kept my face even. I had prepared myself for a number, and the number was still worse than I'd prepared for. But I kept my face even because I had decided, on somewhere in the sleepless hours before dawn, that I was not going to perform my pain for anyone. Not even for her. Not even in private. I said, is it? I stopped, started differently. "What is it, Merritt? What is it to you?" She looked back at me. Her eyes were tired and honest and full of something I recognized as genuine anguish, which didn't make me feel better but did make me feel like I was talking to a real person and not a managed version of one. She said, "It's the most complicated thing that has ever happened to me." I said, "That's not an answer." She said, "I know. I don't have a cleaner one. I'm sorry." We stood in the kitchen for a while longer. The coffee cooled. Outside, a neighbor's dog was barking at something. Short, insistent bursts that stopped and then started again. Normal Saturday morning sounds. The world continuing its normal Saturday morning operation while 14 years of marriage sat between two people in a kitchen trying to figure out what language to use for what was happening. I said, "I don't know what I want to do." She said, "I don't either." I said, "I think that's probably where we are then." She nodded. I picked up my cup. I went to the living room. I sat in the chair by the window. My chair, the one I'd had since before we were married, like the one she had tried to get me to replace twice and I'd refused both times. And I looked out at the street and I drank my coffee, and I thought about what it means to be in the middle of something with no clear edges, no obvious next step. Just the fact of it sitting there, waiting to be decided. That afternoon my phone buzzed. I was in the garage doing nothing in particular. It's the kind of purposeless moving around of objects that men do when they need to be doing something with their hands, and there's nothing that actually needs doing. I picked up my phone expecting something practical. A bill notification. A text from my brother about something mundane. It was a number I didn't have saved. The message said, "I think we should talk. Just us. Not because I owe you an explanation. I know I don't. Not really. But because I think you're the only person in this situation who's been honest, and I think that deserves something. If you want to. No pressure either way." I read it twice. I put my phone face down on the workbench. I stood there in the garage with my hand resting on the workbench next to my face-down phone, and I looked at the wall in front of me. Pegboard with tools hanging on it, everything in its designated place. I'd organized and labeled the way I'd organized and labeled it years ago on a Saturday afternoon when the house was new and the marriage was new and everything had its place and its purpose and its clear, legible shape. I thought about what it would mean to respond. I thought about what it would mean not to. I thought about Merritt upstairs, probably sitting with her phone too, probably aware that Solène had my number now, probably waiting to see what I would do with it. And I thought about 14 years. About the photograph on the nightstand, about the sweater on the back of the kitchen chair and the coffee cup on the drying rack and the same old sound from the hot water heater and all the 10,000 ordinary details that make up a life with someone, that you stop seeing until they're about to be gone. And then you see nothing else. I picked up my phone. I looked at the message again. And I